you probably all know Rusty. When I arrived here at the museum 10 years ago, there was a beautiful 18.5-foot yawl sitting in the garden, and Rusty had built it in the garden over a period of close to 3 months. Okay, evidently being asked questions all the time. We had it here for a while, but unfortunately, it wasn't doing the craft any justice by being out in the elements as it was. So now it's at the Postal History Museum. But that was my introduction to Rusty. And then over the course of many years, this book has been a standard reference to regional and local small craft building. And we're very fortunate to have a copy in the library. Rusty's name has also come up many times as just a wonderful local resource. So we're very happy to have Rusty back to the museum tonight. This talk is being videotaped, and we'll put it up on our website. If you're on our email list, you'll find out when it goes up on the website. But hopefully, let's say, late in the winter, sometime in the winter, I think, we'll have this up, maybe sooner. But this way, what Rusty has to say can be documented and be of use to people all over the world. So, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Rusty. Welcome.
I think I've forgotten what I was going to say. I know most everybody here, so for those that don't know me, this will be a good introduction, I think. Just don't talk to anybody next to you, because it's lies, all lies, especially that guy in the back there. But in any event, I appreciate being invited here. I think it's a great honor to be invited to Ships of the Sea, where on this probably very ground where you're sitting tonight, a lot of the schemes and plans for the first steamship to cross the Atlantic Ocean were laid down by a group of Savannah investors, and that has been the hallmark of Savannah maritime activity. They've always been in the forefront of new technology, and hopefully that will continue. So what we're going to do tonight is take a look at some things that are very old, and basically how we got to the SS Savannah and how we got beyond that. And we're only looking at the tip of the iceberg here, because there have been 5,000 years of maritime documented man and boat activity in this part of the country. And I can only take up so much, and we can take up probably about 499 tonight. But I'll miss one here. Okay, we'll start, and the first thing, of course, is if you were a settler, if you were a colonist voyaging to the southeast coast of America in the 1700s, and you were British, this is what you would have seen. This is the Mole map of 1729, and it illustrates the principal rivers, towns, counties, and Indian settlements of the Southeast Territory. This is what you would have had to deal with. The first thing you notice is that there are a lot of rivers. That's what made this part of the country unusual. The rivers gave access to the interior all the way up to the Indian territories, and provided a means of shelter and support and trade. And basically there's no southeastern port that's not a river town, except for Charleston. Charleston is the only seaport. And Charlestonians like to say that Charleston shows its face to the Atlantic and its backside to the rest of the state. But this is what folks had to deal with. Just to the south of the Georgia area was Spanish Florida. And the area between the Florida border and South Carolina was always in debate. There were constant wars and shifting alliances going on. So when you arrived in the colony of Georgia, your existence could be tenuous. But there's one thing you had to have to make a successful life and to carry on trade and for your economic survival, and that would have been small boats, and that's where we come in. Tony mentioned the book. Everything you'll see tonight, pretty much everything, is contained in there. I have to mention this because a lot of the photographs that are in there, I only have the right to use as part of the book. They're owned by individuals, families, museums that allowed me to use them. And if you can't find a copy locally, you can get it on interlibrary loan, which will have to suffice until it's reprinted. Right now, it's long out of print. But we do go back 500 years, and when you start with man's activity in the boats, the first documented activity took place way to the east of this part of the country in the Bahama Islands. You'll also run into little illustrations like this. This is an illustrated version of Columbus's journal. Columbus ran into these Lucayan Indians on his first voyage to the Bahamas and made particular notice of their mode of waterborne transport. You'll notice that the long spike-shaped ends of the canoes are carefully drawn, as well as the shapes of these paddles. Now, obviously, this is a stylized version. It was done by an Italian artist. They don't have any Lombardy poppers in the Bahamas, at least not then. And this was a distinguishing characteristic of the Lucayan boats that Columbus made special note of. He had seen dugouts before on the coast of Africa, but they were not shaped like this. This paddle was actually found in 1920, I believe, in a cave on Abaco and on Morris Island. And it is illustrative, dates from the time of the Lucayan Indians, of the type of care and craftsmanship that went into their waterborne activities. This paddle is 6 feet in length. It has a nice little T-grip at the top so that you can know the relationship of the blade to the water in dark or light. The blade shape itself is particularly efficient. You can put just a little tip in the water, or you can put the whole blade in for a lot more power. And the point has a nice little rounded tip on it so that you can use it to anchor the boat, or it could even be used as an offensive weapon if you had to. By 1593, when this sketch was made of St. Augustine, St. Augustine, by the way, had been in existence since 1565, but it was an outpost of the Spanish Empire, and you can see even in 1593 they were dealing with pretty much wattle and plank huts with thatched roofs. They were just beginning to start work on the Castillo de San Marcos, and the sketch illustrates the primitive state of the town. It also illustrates the semi-bankruptcy of the Spanish Empire at this point. They were having a hard time because of the incessant wars in Europe, funding everything, and their treasury depended on vessels from the New World laden with gold and other goods to keep things afloat. What was interesting at this was that detail of the wharf right there shows these little dugouts with the same spike projection that you saw in the Lucayan illustration. And as it turns out, that little spike projection on dugout hulls was characteristic of Florida dugouts for the next 200 years. The University of Florida has categorized or cataloged over 200 dugout canoes found in Florida, and almost all of them have this little beak projection. And it's been speculated that this was to keep the ends of the log from splitting or to keep water from coming aboard, but it did survive as a characteristic of the dugout canoe. And you know, people think of the dugout as being primitive, but by the time the British came, they were the primary mode of transport throughout the colonies. This is a typical ad from the 1750s that appeared in Charleston, and these ads were run throughout area newspapers. The canoe was a means of getting around. There was no other road transport. Most streets ended right outside of the major towns. Horse transportation was even difficult. So the only basic way of transport was via the water, and the dugout was a principal method of that. By 1730, these large dugouts were being used to carry goods and trade all the way up the rivers in Carolina and Georgia. This sketch is done by a German artist, Philip Georg Friedrich von Reck, who accompanied Oglethorpe and the Salzburgers to Georgia. And this shows goods being landed about 45 miles upstream from Savannah at the Salzburger settlement of Ebenezer. And you can see that these canoes are quite a bit larger and had been adapted for the mode of carrying cargo. Von Wreck was a good artist, and without him, these sketches, and without these sketches, we really wouldn't know what these boat canoes look like. These things, the sketches came from the Royal Library of Denmark, by the way. They were discovered in 1976, somewhat by accident, and later published by Mills Lane in a book that is entitled Von Wreck's Voyage to Georgia. Von Wreck also did this sketch, which is particularly illustrative of boat types on the Savannah River. This thing here, this large dugout, is called an Indian trade boat, and they ran from about 30 to 40 feet in length, and they carried manufactured goods such as woolens, blankets, musket flints, axes, hatchets, knives, things like this upriver, as well as rum, for trade with the Indians 150 or 200 miles upriver. And these were the Indian trading posts up near Augusta, where the Cherokees and the Creeks would exchange mostly deer skins for these manufactured goods. These vessels were loaded with deer skins and then sent back downriver. The Indian trade was kind of almost like what went on with third world nations from this country in the 1960s or so. The Indians quickly became dependent on manufactured goods, particularly muskets and rum. The rum was mixed 1/3 with water for sale to the Indians, by the way. And on the trip upstream, all the valuable goods were kept right back here in this little cabin where the master could lock them up at night. But if you can imagine rowing a heavy-laden dugout boat 150 or 200 miles against the Savannah River current, it's illustrative of the type of heavy labor people were inured to at the time and had to do to make a living, but would be unthought of today. At this point, these vessels here were using maybe 4 oarsmen to go upriver, and each person, I think engineers tell us that if a guy is in good shape and he's pulling on an oar really hard in a sprint, he can generate about 1/4 horsepower. So that boat would have 1 horsepower to go all the way upriver. Not very much. Downriver was a different story. The amount of deer skins that were involved in this grew steadily throughout the 1700s. By 1764, 800,000 pounds of deer skins were shipped out of Carolina. And that's an enormous amount. That represents about 400,000 deer, since each skin weighed about 200 pounds, or rather 2 pounds. Von Wreck has also sketched in this thing, this other contraption here. One of the merchants at Savannah got impatient with his, the dugouts could only carry a little bit of cargo, and he figured that they would build this large barge-like contraption, put more men in it, and be able to get upriver with more cargo. Unfortunately, the thing did not work against the river. If you've ever rowed a small kayak or canoe or paddled a canoe against the current, you understand why. You need to have a slim vessel to go against the strong current. And that's one reason the dugout was particularly suited in its larger form for use in the southeast, because it could trade the upper rivers with ease. Von Wreck has illustrated how unsuitable this thing was by showing a tremendous number of oarsmen plus another small dugout towing it upstream, and somewhat satirically. The merchant that built this was a prominent Savannah merchant, Thomas Costin, for whom Costin's Bluff is named. And obviously he was embarrassed by this. This sketch later turned up at the Public Record Office in London. Von Wreck was able also to travel to St. Simons, and a different type of dugout hull was used along the coast. This is a larger, more capacious type of hull called a periagua. These things could carry up 20 to 30 tons of cargo and were schooner rigged. The masts would strike or fold down, and they had a couple of little oarlock blocks right here where they could be rowed. Apparently the major mode of power was sweeps. They only sailed when the wind served. And the trip down to St. Simons could take anywhere from 5 days if they were really rowing and sailing hard, or as much as 2 weeks. So for only a 100-mile voyage, it could be a little bit strenuous. You can also see Von Wreck has sketched the helmsman here with a slight awning over here for protection against the sun. And when these were in use, they generally went in convoy down the intercoastal waterway because the fear of Spanish vessels, Spanish privateers offshore was great. And to make them keep together, Oglethorpe did what any general would do. He kept all the potable supplies, including beer, in the lead boat, so that if you wanted anything to eat or drink, you had to keep up with the leader. Until Von Wreck, until this sketch was discovered, no one knew what one of these things looked like, as no archaeological remains have turned up that have been recognizable. So this is the only sketch in existence of a colonial periagua. You can see in the close-up that these little areas right here were the main form of propulsion when the wind failed. My guess is folks would rather probably just sit and wait for the wind to return rather than try to row this heavy vessel. The tide also helped them move around. This is a later dugout. This is the interior of the Bessie, which is a dugout plantation boat from the 1850s in Charleston Museum. And you see the interior by then looks pretty much like a boat, except there's no frames and planking, just the seats. This is the stern. These cracked and split areas. This is what happens when a large dugout hull is taken out of the water and allowed to dry. Dugouts were made to stay in the water, and that's where they can live for 100 years. I've got one at my house that's been in the water for 20 years, and it's still the same as when it went in, but it stays wet. It stays in the water. Once you take them out and put them in a museum, they go to the devil pretty quick. Bessie had a centerboard added for sailing a little later on. This is the lines of Bessie, and this you can see that the big difference between planked craft and dugouts. Up until this section right in here, Bessie could have been a plank-built boat. But right in here, this transition would have been very difficult to do with plank. Dugouts allowed you to carve a very delicate shape into a vessel that could not be gotten without extreme torturing or steaming of plank. Which was simply just not done generally in the Southeast. There was, however, the skill available and the time and wood available to carve these nice shapes into dugout hulls. But Bessie at 1855 was one of the last to be built of that size, and what replaced the dugout was larger plank dugout craft like this. This is actually a rice barge that was built for the Santee Canal, and it is each side of this is 1/2 of a dugout log, probably one of the larger dugout types that was built. This is about 50 feet in length. And you know a little bit about this photo because this thing sank about where it's pictured in 1905 and was excavated in 1970 by the University of South Carolina. But at this point, the dugout was on its way out as southeastern mode of transport. And this is what replaced it, the plank-built batteau or skiff, flat-bottom skiff. This is a picture from Bradley Point on Wilmington Island. And this little guy right here, actually after the book was published, I got a call from a man who said he was this little boy. His name was Reverend Jackson, and he said this was his boat, and this was his father's oyster packing house on Bradley Point. And he gave me enough detail to make me believe that it was so. Batteaus or flat-bottom skiffs came in all shapes and sizes, square and chunky and heavy like this, and nice and light like this. And once sawn plank became readily available, they were far easier to build, cheaper to build, and quicker to build than any dugout was. So they quickly replaced all other forms of personal waterborne and cargo transport. If you were in Charleston and you needed to get across Charleston Harbor, you take one of these. This is a Charleston ferry boat. If you didn't have the money for the steam ferry, these gentlemen would take you across for a nickel or a dime maybe. There's a larger dugout hull right there in the back, but this is a plank-built batteau of about 20 feet in length. They came even larger. Many of the offshore islands had populations that needed to get to market or for some other reason needed to get to the major ports and major hubs of commerce. So these inter-island ferries, as it were, ran from most of the outlying islands. They were privately operated, privately maintained, and in some cases not well maintained. So they would end up having near capsizes, sinkings, and other disasters. This picture is taken probably around turn of the century, just off Beaufort. The foot of Barnard Street in Savannah in the 1930s looked like this. This is a sketch by Christopher Murphy. And right above at the top of the hill was the city market above the bluff. And folks from the outlying islands used to come in these market sloops, or basically big, large, enlarged battoes to sell their produce at the city market. And the city market was a lively place, as you can imagine. You could get anything you want, any type of game or fish, duck eggs, turtle eggs, raccoon, possum. From all accounts, it was a lively spot. And this is how most of the produce came in. When we found this picture, I thought we had a sailing barge or a nice squared off barge type hull. This is the Alphine of Charleston. Barrels, by the way, were some of the first cargo containers. This thing looked like it couldn't get out of its own way, and I thought it had to be maybe 50, 60 feet in length. But no, a few weeks after we found this picture, we found the other end of it. And this shows that the Alphine was only 30 feet in length and was actually 15 feet wide, so it was rectangular, almost absolutely rectangular. And it was very shallow. You can see it's sitting on the bottom right here. And it was typical of the type of sailing cargo vessel that would make its way through the sounds and the rivers to the major ports. Another interest here is that there were very few, if any, floating docks at this time. This was turn of the century, and people would make just a heavy log cribbing, fill it with brick rubble or something of this nature so it'd sit down, and vessels slid down these inclined pilings and just sat where they were on the bottom. If they didn't want to sit upright, then a system of timbers would be laid down so that they could sit on the timbers. Upriver in Augusta, a completely different type of craft was used for cargo. This is the Slim Petersburg boat. These vessels brought cargo from towns above Augusta. At one time, the Savannah River was the longest river on the eastern seaboard that emptied into the Atlantic. And before dams, it's got, 6 dams along its length now? But before dams, it ran from almost up near the North Carolina border and the South Carolina conjunctions all the way down to the city of Savannah. Augusta built the Savannah Canal, or rather the Augusta Canal in the 1850s, and ran all traffic coming downriver through the city center. This was great. It was a great engineering project. It's still in operation. At that time, the water flow off from the canal powered these fabric mills through a system of belts and sluice gates. Now, the canal runs the same water through the sluice gates, but electric generators are hooked up to it so that the city sells power back to Georgia Power. These vessels were 7 feet wide, but could be up to 60 or 70 feet in length. And the reason for the narrow width is there were some rapids above Augusta that they had to get through. They may look crude, but we had experience bringing one of these downriver with the long sweep like that, and it works very well. I built a replica for the city of Augusta in 1993 and brought it to Tybee with an Augusta crew, and it worked great the whole way. I'm just glad I didn't have to take it back upriver. That would have been a good bit more difficult. In fact, I think they towed it most of the way. By then, steamers were starting to appear on the major rivers. This is an early one, the Macon. The Macon exploded sometime after this illustration was drawn. And they also changed the configuration of most of them so that the cabins and pilot house were forward of the steam plant, because while the artist has drawn this going this way, we usually went this way, right over the accommodations. So it made things a little messy. And the artist, by the way, here was a very famous South Carolinian, Charles Hayward. The Haywards had 17 rice plantations in Carolina and Georgia in the 1820s and 30s. If you can imagine the wealth that involved, and it would be probably akin to one of the Microsoft folks today. Anyway, Charles had the time and the money to experiment with vessels. This is one he started, which is a hand-cranked affair that's connected to paddle wheels. Then he got a steam engine, and this is a dugout hull, by the way, and the way you can get that is that little finely carved stern back there. And this engine was connected to a couple of linked paddles, which was supposed to propel the boat along. It didn't work exactly as planned, and Hayward had to try some other contraptions. He was quite the inventor. He tried a sailing version of the paddle wheel propulsion. This vessel had a spherical arrangement of 4 sails, which were supposed to catch the wind no matter which way it blew. And the pivoting of the sails would then turn a crank, which turned the paddle wheel. And sometimes it probably worked pretty good. Other times when the wind really piped up, it got a little precarious. And at some point, Hayward decided that he'd had enough and drew the whole thing when the inevitable happened, and he ended overboard. The contrary was the vessel's name, and that was the last we saw of it. Hayward then went and put the steam engine to the paddle wheels in the proper manner and proceeded to tour his plantations. This is a rice barge in the background, by the way. So at this point, the engine age was upon us. In South Carolina, Georgia, and northeastern Florida, it was a little slower in coming than the rest of the country. And folks here always had to end up doing their own work. This is actually Charles Hayward himself. Something's wrong with the engine crank, and he's having to work on it. You've seen the same scene at any boat ramp on a Sunday afternoon. Something's wrong with the motor. Mama's upset. The kids are getting sunburned and bug bit. The picnic lunch is getting hot. It's a nasty operation for everybody. And the kid's about to get hit in the face with the crank. So Charles Hayward was not only an artist, he was a humorist. And I don't think he expected anybody was going to be looking at this journal, 180 years or so from now. But it's certainly been an inspiration to everybody that we show it to. By then, most of the major rivers had steamers on them. This is a very small one, the Katy, bound up all the way up the Altamaha to its junction with the Oconee River. And this is actually taken in the 1920s. And by then, most of the timbering had been done along a lot of the major rivers. And this is the method that the timber harvesters used to get downstream. This is a timber raft, and you can see its construction. Timber was basically squared off on site, formed into large rafts, held together with other timbers and pegs. A little hut was put on for cooking and sleeping, a little sweep back here, and off they would go downriver. And in the case of some of these, it would be a pretty good voyage if you were talking about coming all the way from, let's say, Macon all the way downstream to Darien. This shows the whole thing, and this would have been a small one. In the early days of this, the late 1800s, these things could be 3 or 4 times this length, tied together by chains. Timber harvesting was a major business in South Carolina and Georgia, and also northern Florida. So that went on and still goes on, although the timber's carried in a different manner. Another steamer type is shown in the wilds of Florida around the turn of the century, about 1880 or 90. This is the steamer Tuscaloosa, and it is a very particular type of craft made just for this river. By this time, tourists had discovered Florida, and one of the big attractions was hopping on one of these steamers at Jacksonville and going all the way down the St. Johns and to its conjunction with another river called the Ocklawaha River, and down the Ocklawaha River all the way to Silver Springs. The entire journey overland probably was only about 100 miles, but by river it was over 250 miles. And the reason is because the rivers were so sinuous and tortuous and narrow. These boats were built expressly for this. Whoops. Notice you don't see any paddle wheels sticking out here. And it wasn't propeller driven, it was paddle wheel driven. But what they had to do was hide the paddle wheel inside the vessel because of tree branches that may get caught in it and stumps it was subject to. This is another vessel, the Okahumpki, that was built just for this passenger service. This service went on until the 1930s. Obviously, Mr. Flagler's railroad and later the highways cut into their business, so that by the beginning of the 30s, almost no one was taking these vessels anymore, and they gradually fell into disuse. But for the period of late 1800s to 1920, if you wanted to see Florida, this is how you saw it. Jacksonville also had Merrill Stevens Engineering Company, which made these private little steamers for folks that could afford them. You could get one of these little vessels, which is 37 feet long, 9.5 foot beam, 3 foot depth, only drew 12 inches of water, burned wood or coal, and they'll duplicate for $1,200. So it's a pretty good deal. Expensive for the time, but it was an excellent way of traversing the St. Johns, and a lot of people took advantage of it, so many so that Merrill Stevens went from being a machine shop to a large yacht construction firm, and later ended up having offices all over the world. Most of the larger steamers, though, confined themselves to inter-island traffic. This is the steamer Islander at Bluffton, just around the turn of the century. You see a little oyster sloop in the foreground down here, and this is how folks got around. The Islander would go from Hilton Head to Beaufort, stopping at Bluffton, and then would come on into Savannah. And a lot of people availed themselves of this method of transport because it was basically the only method of transport other than private watercraft. At this time, though, the discovery of oil and petroleum in Pennsylvania, coupled with the advent of the internal combustion engine, was beginning to make itself felt locally. The Gibbs engine was a product of a Jacksonville inventor, George Gibbs, and was a particularly efficient little contraption. By the early 1920s, almost everybody was investing in this type of machinery. Another local inventor, Stacey Levy of Charleston, figured that he would design a watercraft that was more suited to the engine power and running at high speed than the local vessels were. And he came up with the double V hydroplane that he calls it. Anybody that has a modern boat will recognize this as the cathedral hull, but Stacey Levy patented it in 1919, long before Boston Whaler or any of the other builders. He got involved with some other patents, optical lenses, this sort of thing, and forgot about this little vessel. So it was left to be reinvented in the 1950s as the cathedral hull and built by the thousands by numbers of different boat builders. By then, this is what you had in most of the magazines and newspapers. Ole Evinrude had invented in 1909, his detachable outboard rowboat motor, and was advertising it in the best way possible with an attractive young miss at the tiller, in total control of a snarling beast. This lady was kind of scantily clad for the period too, which they still use in outboard motor ads, so it's an effective technique. Of course, it wasn't long before that led to this. Every little girl in the country that had a bateau, or every boy for that matter, wanted an outboard to free them from the tedium of rowing these things around. Bateaus could row, and the slim ones could row pretty easily, but the big ones, if you were facing a foul tide and a wind against you, it was much better just to tie up somewhere and wait for things to change. This is Mary Bernard Godey on Richardson Creek sometime around 1930 in one of her father's boats with a 5-horse Johnson. And you can see the look on her face. It's just, I mean, to anyone who's had to row a bateau, to have an outboard motor that would actually work for a while was just sheer amazement. There's a lot of people that disparage outboards, but I'm not one of them. I think it was a fantastic invention. And although you may curse them every once in a while, they sure do help you get around. The early ones could be a little dangerous. They could spout gas not only out the front, but the back of the carburetor. The magneto ignition on most of them, if you weren't careful and you had a couple of inches of water in the bottom of the boat, would give you a little tingle when you crank things up. So you had to watch where you put your fingers. You can see that most of the machinery here is open, but that's how you learn. If you lost a finger or so in the flywheel, you wouldn't do it again. This is Mary's sister, Catherine Godey, and this is the same boat. This is before it was cut down for the outboard. And Catherine Godey was 16 years old when this picture taken, and it's in Richardson Creek, and this is their mule Patty, who for 20 of his 26 years pulled a plow on cotton hammock on the other side of their house across Richardson Creek. And Catherine used to row him over there. And this is basically the epitome of southeastern watercraft innovation solution as far as I'm concerned. You have a young girl that is making the best of a very difficult job, has obviously trained Patty to step in the boat very gingerly and very easily. And if you can imagine what Patty would do with a 5-horse outboard on the back, you know why she's rowing him over. This photo was not staged. You can see that this little puddle here shows that she actually is rowing Patty over. And this is one of her father's 18-foot bateaus, very capacious and seaworthy. Her father was Clarence Godey, and he ran a little camp for kids on Whitmarsh Island, and built these bateaus as more for hobby than anything else, although he did sell them to others. Bateaus were also used for the oyster business, and in combination with engine power, they were great load carriers. This is two 18 by 6 foot bateaus carrying 40 bushels of oysters each, which is about 4,000 pounds of weight. You notice that the oysters, how they're stacked in the boat, they're piled properly so that the boat will have less of a tendency to capsize, and they're being towed at a very low rate of speed, but they're being towed a lot faster than they could be rowed. This is from the Majoni plant, and it's just prior to World War II. The normal way of carrying oysters to the plant was by sailing bateau, and this shows one, the Lewis Hunter, coming into port with a full deck load of oysters. And these boats weren't the best sailors. They would sail when the wind was right, and certainly it was a good way to move things when the wind favored, but they weren't particularly speedy, and they didn't do that well to windward. That what they were was cargo carriers, and that was their primary purpose. After World War II, most of these were converted to power. This shows one, the Hopeful, that the mast has been taken out of and converted to power. After World War II, the widespread availability of surplus gas engines made it a no-brainer for most fishermen. They almost inevitably all used the Chrysler Crown 115 horse gas motor that they could buy dirt cheap from government surplus, and the Hopeful was one case of this. This shows another oyster boat. The oyster business was, by the time the Hopeful was done in the late 1940s, already in decline, and by the time this picture was taken in 1979, was really not what it used to be. You have to remember that the Georgia and Carolina oyster harvest was equal to any other place in the country around the turn of the century. And the Carolina harvest alone in 1920 was something like 8 million pounds of oysters. But by the 30s, 40s, 50s, and then 70s, a combination of pollution, shortage of labor, and other problems led to a decline in the oyster business. Looking at this from the water, you might think it's just another old beaten up, run down oyster boat. This is at Ladies Island at the Majoni oyster canning plant in 1979. But if you went around to the bow, you'd see this unbelievable shape. This is the oyster boat, bi-boat Tugadoo. And it was built by Gerald and Will Watkins of Bluffton in 1948 for the Majoni oyster business. And I just happened to be there, and Tugadoo was never going to float again. At this point, it was on the waves. It was going to stay there. A few weeks after this photograph was taken, it was burned right where it sat because it just wasn't useful anymore. It was going to take too much to repair it. But what got me is what a great job of planking these guys did. This is a very shallow hull. It could carry, 60,000 pounds of oysters, but look at how difficult this is. They did a wonderful job, and they're basically two builders nobody ever heard of. They did a building outside in the sun, day or night, and put this thing together and made almost artwork out of the bottom plank. One of Tugadu's sister ships, Chief, this was built in 1952, and that is coming up to the plant with about 60,000 pounds of oysters on deck. That type of volume could be handled at any number of oyster canneries during the period. The Majoni plant alone in Ladies Island could can 40,000 bushels of oysters a day, and had the market for them. Things have fallen off a bit since then. Even in 1937, there were polluted areas that were being delineated regarding the oyster leases and the concerns about pollution. Most of the polluted areas at that time were around the large paper mills. But even then, there was concern. You know, we talked to a number of oystermen at the time, and they had memories of earlier days when things were different and a little better. But things change, and that was a theme that they always emphasized. One of the old timers over at Majoni's place was asked about the size of the oysters in the old days, and he said, well, he couldn't tell you about the size, but 4 of them, shuck out, would fill up a pint cup, which is good size. Just as a way of illustration, this is an oyster shell from 1860, right? So it's a good size oyster. Today they're a little bit smaller than this. Certainly the local oysters have gotten a lot smaller. However, if you want to talk about size, you got to go back a lot further. This is the shell from 50 million years ago, up at Shell Bluff, up the Savannah River. And I know everybody here knows that the shoreline of the ocean used to be up just below Augusta, right? I'm sure you do. Otherwise, how could this guy have gotten there? So it was about 30 feet up in the bluff. So things change, and the oysterman was right. Going back 50 million years is not necessary to see change, but in this case, you can see it just since 1937. A lot of the fishermen think that things have actually gotten better since 37, but it's about 50-50 split. The other half think that they have just gotten a different type of pollution. It's not by paper mills so much anymore as by non-point source agricultural runoff and this sort of thing. But as the oyster industry was declining, another industry was building up. And this is the first glimpse of the power-drawn shrimping industry in Fernandina, Florida, about 1910 or so. This is the Rene Goddard, one of the first shrimp boats to use power to actually shrimp under power. And this was a kind of cobbed-together vessel. Around the turn of the century, the 1900s, the confluence of Mediterranean immigrants, Sicilians, Italians, Portuguese, along with ready availability of engine power and the introduction of a new net, the otter trawl. These are actually otter boards here on the stern of this vessel. And a market for shrimp, which was provided because refrigeration techniques had just been improved, led to the birth of the shrimping industry, the power-drawn shrimping industry. Before that, it was all seine net and cast net. And this vessel has the earmarks of all shrimpers that followed it. A little raised deck here forward, because all the work was done off the stern, a good bit of shear, and of course the mast and the 2 otter trawls back aft. By 1920, the fleet had gotten huge, only 10 years later. This is John Sandos with the St. Augustine fleet. And you can see the characteristic lines of a shrimper that anyone would recognize today. They still have a vestigial raised deck and a cabin there. And these are what's called single rig shrimpers. They only have one boom or outrigger and a large working deck back aft with a hatch. By the 1940s, the Greek hull was almost totally predominant with shrimpers. This is the Vagabond, built in 1948 by Mike Tiliakos in Fernandina. And the Vagabond is shown here at Thunderbolt and has vestigial raised deck right here. There's a little step right there. House, and again, single rig net. Vagabond was powered by a 40 horsepower Lathrop engine. It weighed 900 pounds, so it was not that small. And the horses were good-sized horses, but it was still only a 40-horsepower engine. After the war, the widespread availability of steel, welders, and demand for shrimp boats led a bunch of local yards to start building steel shrimpers. Savannah Machine and Shipyard built this prototype, Gold Nugget, in 1949. And the Nugget was supposedly a nasty roller. The story was that they took a naval architect down the Thunderbolt, got him drunk, brought him back, and this is what he drew. One captain that went out on the Nugget never went back. The boat probably did more to hurt the reputation of Savannah Machine and Shipyard than any other project they had done. And the Nugget ended up its days as a towboat on the Mississippi without its rig and most of its upper works. The final incarnation of shrimpers was the Desco line out of St. Augustine, Florida. Desco Marine was turning out these 68-footers in 1970 at the rate of 4 per week. And these boats were mostly destined for the South American and Gulf fisheries. This one is headed to Texas. They were huge plank-built vessels powered by Caterpillar diesels. The name Desco is an acronym for Diesel Engine Sales Company. The engine manufacturers and boat builders got together and figured if they packaged it all together, things would be, sales would pick up, and they were right. That was the heyday of the shrimp fishery. The power-drawn shrimping industry was responsible for the largest fleet of wooden work craft this has ever seen, and some of these are still around. As the years go on, though, they're getting less and less. By then, these vessels were pulling double rig nets so that they would have a combined trawling width of about 150 feet across the bottom. Just so you make sure that all innovation is not stopped in terms of local vessels. This is Rob White of South Georgia running really fast and really shallow in about 6 inches of water with his design of his actual interpretation of an earlier design. This boat is powered by a Kubota diesel engine, believe it or not, and it gets about 28 miles to the gallon, something that most modern vessels don't do. Rob is no longer with us. You'll have to tell him hello and then goodbye as his vessel turns out of sight. You can see the bottom in this. Rob was probably the best boat builder that certainly the South has ever seen in terms of innovation, and possibly probably one of the best in the country, if not the world. Anyway, you'll tell Rob goodbye and myself as well, because that is the end of our presentation. I don't know if we have time for any questions, but I'll leave that up to Tony, or if there are any. I mean, I can go on for a while. I'm not tired or proud.
Is Desco and St. Augustine called Desco?
No, they're out of business. Yeah, I don't know if anybody's got the name, but they went out of business some years back. St. Augustine trawlers lasted a while longer, I think, but I'm not sure of the situation down there. One thing I did want to mention, you know, this book has got my name on it, but a lot of the research in there and a lot of the work was done by others who assisted with this. And in order to see the full list, you'll have to get one of the books because it takes up a couple of pages. But without all that work, I mean, I'm just the front man, kind of. There's just a ton of people that helped out, and a lot of those folks have moved on, and some are still around. There's a lot of people in the local area that have been doing this for years, and Judy Wood and folks like that. Dave Scott in the back has contributed a little bit to it. In fact, there's a whole section in the book on the Stevens family of South Carolina and their early days of interisland transport that you won't see anywhere else probably. Anyway, anything else? Yes, sir.
Could you say a word or two about live oak and live oaking from colonial times on up?
Well, you know, live oaking was a trade that was practiced, but also the live oak, the local live oak, and when I'm saying local, I mean South Carolina, Georgia, and northern Florida, provided most of the framing timber for the United States Navy vessels. There was a time when other nations wanted this as well. So there was actually a French group that tried to buy St. Catherine's Island just for its live oak, and were prohibited from doing so by the United States government at one point. Up until the 1860s or so, live oak was cut and shaped in the local areas for shipment back up north for U.S. Navy vessels. And it was Pensacola on the Florida panhandle actually had a pond where a lot of this stuff had been stored since that time. That was when they started to redo the USS Constitution for one of its major rebuilds. They went to Pensacola to try and get some of this up. Unfortunately, most of it was so smelly and nasty that they left it where it was and cut new stuff. It's not being used for anything that I know of other than restoration of older vessels right now. In fact, a couple years back, I asked a Savannah Park and Tree Commission guy what they did with the stuff they cut, and they take it to the dump. Maybe 4 truckloads a week. It's very difficult. It doesn't really burn well. The grain is tight and interlocking. Not many people mess with it for firewood. It just doesn't cut well. It never really dries out. If you cut a piece and then you cut into it at some 6, 7, 8 months, a year, 2 years down the road, the interior will still be kind of damp and wet. Rob White, who you just saw, had more experience dealing with it than I do, and he relates the tale that he had cut a bunch for a northern shipbuilding firm when he was young and full of vim and vinegar, and cut a bunch and stuck it next to his shop to dry, thinking it would, you know, be there a couple months. And he came out the next morning and the stack was 2 feet higher because this stuff had twisted around and started to move. So he took his bulldozer and he drove it up and he sat it on top of it. And the stuff still moved. It was another 6 inches higher the next day. So after a while, he took the bulldozer off and took the stuff out and started to cut it into smaller pieces because, according to him, the only way to keep it from moving is to fasten it to something stronger than it is. So the only time I've used it, I used it in a reproduction vessel, and it was cut after it was felled and immediately fastened into place. It wasn't allowed to dry, wasn't allowed to move. We found that hand tools, sharp hand tools, worked better than power saws and things of this nature. It is just perfectly suited for what it was used for, which was the framing timbers and difficult parts of large wooden vessels, but the very devil to work and handle. And the labor involved in its early harvesting and use must have been unbelievable. Anyway, Dave.
Yeah, you know, you in particular are really strong in the history of maritime craft in this, you know, this area, and I compliment you on that. But also, you and your brother and other people, I mean, you guys have been on the cusp of new technology. You know, moving ahead like Savannah has been. You know, I mean, what do we look for in the future? What do you see as maritime future? You know, how do we advance and go on ahead to be on the leading edge? I mean, you're in the
You can always trust Dave to come up with the easy questions.
No, it's easy. I mean, what do you think?
We should introduce Dave Scott. Dave owns a shipyard here. He has been a marine surveyor for I don't know how many years. He knows more about parking meters than anybody else, having gone through a nice apprenticeship of working downtown.
Only because I read it from your.
All right.
But I mean, seriously, I mean, where do we go? we were the leaders, you know, at times of nuclear power. You know what I'm saying. I mean,
Absolutely.
where do we go from here?
There's always been a group of people, or more than one, willing to take the lead in any endeavor in Savannah. They've been bold. They've had to be bold because Savannah as a port has distinct disadvantages. It's 15 miles from the ocean. To get vessels to come up here, you have to provide something. You have to provide super port facilities. You have to provide logistics, and you have to do a heck of a sales job. Savannah, people involved with the port have always been in the forefront of that, to the extent that I think Savannah as a port is what, #3 on the East Coast now in terms of container volume. But what Dave's saying is, what's the next step? Vessels are getting bigger, 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 bigger. Every port is in competition for traffic, for container volume and traffic. And how do we make the next leap? The container business, by the way, was started by one man, pretty much, Malcolm McLean, who, while a truck driver waiting on the docks, thought that there must be a better way to move cargo and freight than to hoist it piece by piece and put it into the holds of ships. So almost on his own, he began scheming and planning, and eventually got his own trucking firm, and then bought a converted World War II tanker, which he converted to the first container vessel, and started packing things in containers and shipping them around the world. It took many, many years for this to catch on, but now containerization is the primary mode of cargo transport throughout the world, and it enables just-in-time manufacturing. It enables the tracking of containers. It enables you to go to Walmart and buy a 40-piece China set for $12. It would cost you $2,000 to ship it by any other way. But as Dave points out, what's the next step? What's the next leap in technology? And I think that depends on the individual initiative, and this area, and not only this area, but this country, creating a climate of inventiveness and innovation that people can profit by that. So if that's an answer, will you accept that or not? No? Well, talking about one of it, Dave has started his own shipyard and had to do innovation himself, because how long did it take that dry dock to get up and running? Yeah, so anyway, yes?
I wanted to address, follow up on what you just said and what you were talking about is innovations. We just had the Solutions Exchange, the Savannah Ocean Exchange Solutions Exchange, and one of the things that we are trying to do is to look at innovations from different parts of the country, from the world, and connect those so that we're moving these innovations forward. And the solution that won this year, this was the inaugural year, was something that that's called a wave glider. But what this person did, Sunil, I can't remember his last name, but what he did was take something that looks like a door with louvers on it, and that actually uses the wave motion to propel forward. So it actually can take for instance, a data sonde, something that is taking the temperature, the conductivity, the salinity, anyway, the turbidity in the water, and but these sensors need to go way out into the middle of the ocean. Well, it costs tens of thousands of dollars every day for a ship to take these packages out there. But if this little door-like thing with the louvers is used, then that's an extremely inexpensive way to propel those sensors in out into the deep ocean. So it's almost like the technology doesn't really have to be so nuclear or so expensive, but just using the engineering and the understanding of wave energy, was super with this invention. So that's another possibility, and that is what the Savannah Ocean Exchange is all about, is celebrating, you know, searching for and rewarding these very innovative technologies that are coming out. Just thought I'd throw that in there.
Well, I don't know what to say to that. I think that that type of thing is, and more of it, is going to be what's necessary. I mean, I'm looking around the room. There are a lot of brilliant people here tonight. I see people I hadn't seen in a long time, but they're all, I mean, they wouldn't be here if they weren't thinking people. So I guess the challenge goes out, you know, not necessarily to you individually, but as a group, and certainly in concert with South Carolinians and Floridians to form regional alliances to put this part of the country and to keep this part of the country in the forefront of maritime events and technology. I think it can be done, and I think it's going to have to be done. There is tremendous competition around the world from the Far East, and you know, it's interesting. Every 200 years, the scene of things seems to shift. In the 12 and 1300s, the Mediterranean was the frontier. It was Mare Nostrum, our sea, and the Italians, the Venetians were the ones in charge. 200 years after that, it had shifted quite a bit. The Spanish and Portuguese were the ones doing the pioneering. 200 years later, it was the English, French, and Dutch colonizing America and basically the rest of the world. 200 years after that, by the late 1700s, early 1800s, it was our turn, the United States of America. Fortunately, this country has a foothold in both oceans, the Atlantic and Pacific. And my guess is that 200 years, roughly right about now, the frontier is really, in terms of cargo and transition, is on the west and in the Pacific. So that leaves the East Coast and the Atlantic countries that border the Atlantic to come up with innovative new ways of keeping themselves in the loop, because they're quickly going to be surpassed by the type of money and inventiveness and sheer numbers coming from the other side of the world. Anyway, I think that probably brings us to a close. Anything specific that we can home in on? No?
Do you plan
Yes,
to
sir.
publish any more books?
What's that?
Do you plan to publish any more books? Are you planning to write and publish any more books?
Get back to work, sir.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's a question of you know, time and money. I've got a great one scheduled for when I do get the time. It's a story of a vessel that went ashore here in the 1700s, and every piece of it screams out to be told. But it's going to have to wait till I got a lot of time to mess with it. In any event, we thank you all for coming. Thank Ships of the Sea for hosting us, and the Ocean Exchange for putting the whole thing together. I don't get to do this very often. I'm really thankful that all of you came to hear me stumble through this, and we'll see you later.